And so thank you to everyone who's joined this evening. We have a really extraordinary group of people who are with us tonight. Lord Singh, Lord Inderjit Singh, many of you will know, one of the most important and influential Sikhs in the country. Elizabeth Oldfield, who is herself probably one of the leading thinkers on religious life in this country. Zia Chaudhry, a great writer on Muslim life in this country, and Rabbi Laura Janner-Klausner, who is also one of the great leaders of Reform Judaism in this country. And we meet, of course, at the beginning of what is a hugely significant week for people of faith. Passover comes on Wednesday night. It is, of course, Holy Week. We are headed into Easter. And so we thought this would be an opportune time to try and think about faith and the crisis we're in. Before we get to it, I just want to make sure that if you're new to a ThinkIn, you know exactly how it works. We're on a Zoom call. That basically means there are two really great ways that you can weigh in at any time. On the bottom of the screen, you'll see there's a tab, right? There's a tab there. It says participants. If you click on it, you'll see the name of everyone that's here and joined our ThinkIn. You'll also see a little grey box that says raise hand. And if you raise your hand, I can see it, a little blue digital hand goes up. I can see there's Jamie Bell, there's Curtis, hello Holly Northmore, hello Katie Vanek-Smith, my co-founder. Everyone is waving at me, and it's a way of saying, hey, I've got something to say, can I join the conversation? We've got a brilliant team of people who make sure that we do come to you, and we want to try and hear from as many people as possible. If at the same time, you've got a point that you want to make as the conversation's going on, there's a second route in, which is you'll see at the bottom, there's also the chat tab. If you just click on chat, you can actually, when we've just seen Gillian saying that she's got no volume. Does everyone else have volume? Oh, no. Hang on, Megan's sorting out Gillian's. You see, look at that, the kindness of strangers. Megan is helping Gillian figure out the volume on her call. Already, we're helping each other. But that's what the chat is there to do, is to comment on the conversation that we're having. As the discussion goes on, I might come to you if you've made a point in the chat and said, hey, listen, are you willing to weigh in and take part in the conversation? But Liz Mosley, my colleague, fellow editor at Tortoise, is there hopefully responding and party to that whole conversation. So can I do something that's partly a test of whether you've been listening and understand the technology, and partly a profound reflection on the nature of this crisis and your approach to faith, which is this. I want to ask a question and start with this question. I was reading a New York Times piece which said that the origin of the word apocalypse is actually Greek, that it comes from apocalypsis, and that the true original meaning of apocalypsis was that it was an unveiling, that it was a revelation. And who here, if you can click on the raise hand tab, who here thinks that we are living through, whether in the strictly religious sense or not, a kind of revelation, in that sense, a classical apocalypse? Yes. Now, I'm embarrassed to say that I still haven't mastered the technology well enough to be able to do an immediate count. But if you've been to our ThinkIns in our newsroom, you'll also know that I wasn't able to do a really good count there either. But I would say about a third of people are saying that's the case. So I'm going to come, if I may, first to Lord Singh, to Inderjit Singh, and get your view on it. The one thing I should say about a ThinkIn, if you've not been to one before, is we do have one very small rule, and that is that it's not about asking questions. We don't want questions. We want you to tell us your point of view, your experience. And the reason for that is we've been to enough panel discussions where, you know, sage voices are questioned on their view. Actually, we want to try and have, as I said, an organized system of listening, a way of learning altogether. So with that one caveat, please do weigh in with your point of view, with your experience. We've got an hour, so let's get started. Lord Singh, do you feel as though there's any meaning to the question what does God make of the coronavirus? How are you interpreting it in any religious way?
I don't think it is a helpful question. I do not think that God enters into the minutiae of the mess human beings get into. He's given us a wonderful, God has given us a wonderful world with everything. We've messed it up. Some years ago I was asked a question on a BBC programme. The discussion was on what does God think of us? And my reaction was to say that if God really had human emotions, they would be utter disgust at the antics of the human race and a determination to keep us far away from any truly intelligent life in the vastness of his cosmos. Now, I can elaborate further.
No. Well, I'm going to come back to you if I can, Lord Singh, in a moment. But I can't work out whether Rabbi Laura Janner-Klausner is laughing, smiling knowingly, or with a hint of resignation. Rabbi, what do you think of that?
What Lord Singh just said. I think it's you also just said it in such a beautiful way. I do think there is an unveiling going on. And I think it does, I do feel differently because I have a different theology about the mixture of humans and a divine force working together. And I think what we are seeing is the effects of random and the human and the divine working together. And the piece that, of course, is interesting in this is the human agency.
Mm-hmm.
How much do we get ourselves into this? How much are we going to get out of this without relying on divine agency, which can't be proven?
But that's a very interesting thing, isn't it, Rabbi? Because I suppose, and this is a subject that is touched upon by Lord Singh's comments, which is the idea that we now look towards God as a measure and an instrument of driving a better human behavior. It's more about our agency than, as you say, divine agency. And is that the way in which you interpret the relationship between God and the terrible crisis we find ourselves in?
I'm just going to separate the two questions. The first one is about agency. So I don't know the answer to God's agency. So my attempt is to godliness, because who knows? And the second one, I don't know what, as Lord Singh said so beautifully, God will be making, and you're projecting human emotions on a divine. However, I do believe that in the overall, there is a positive direction for the universe. And therefore you have to say, well, if that is your starting place, that there is good in the universe, how do we ensure that we go towards, that we as humans go towards that good? If that's a kind of stream, we need to be going after that stream.
Right. Rabbi, I'm going to come back to you, but I do want to just hear an opening thought from you, Zia Chaudhry. Zia, what do you think? Do you think it's also if you like, such an abstract question, God and the coronavirus? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I do think it's an abstract question, but it's one that does lead us, hopefully, to reflect. And I think that that's what coronavirus or any other aspect of life does. It gives you opportunities to stop and think. Now, ordinarily, I think we struggle to take those opportunities. So it takes something drastic that will make us pause and start asking those questions that really should be daily questions. So, we look at this as some apocalyptic event. Why? Because so many people are suffering. But the reality is that I would say that's maybe a particularly Western approach to this, that suffering is something that's quite novel. It's something that many of us are unused to. Whereas if you ask people from around the world, suffering is their daily life. This is a different kind of suffering, but they have this daily battle, this daily questioning. Well, why is God making me suffer? Why is this happening? Why are we poor? Why have we got no education? And I think we are maybe privileged that we can every once, in a few decades, we can say, is God trying to tell us something? But I think the reality is that these opportunities, if my child falls ill, I'm going to be asking certain questions, and it shouldn't I would say the lesson is perhaps that it shouldn't take those events for us to ask the questions.
So Zia, can I ask you though, and I suppose I'm trying to reach for an understanding of the way in which we in our societies, or we in our societies think about God today, and it follows on from the comments that Lord Singh made, that the Rabbi made, which is that we now look to God to guide behavior, those people who have faith. We don't look to claim that God is responsible for what befalls us in life. And that is a very fundamental change in the way in which people for centuries have considered religion. Because that's the thing, if you like, that all three of you have said at the top. Is that what you think too? Do you not think that this is in some way an act of God?
I don't think it's an act of God. I make this point straight away that I know many of my co-religionists, many fellow Muslims will say this is some sort of punishment, this is some sort of divine intervention. I don't take that view. What I would say is that this is, I mean, the point you made is that you made about guidance, God looking to guide us. I think again, God has always provided guidance. It's just that we sometimes are more receptive to it than on other occasions. I think, this is something that if you look at our daily lives now, my big worry is that we don't take opportunities, but now this is, I would say, an opportunity. It's part of those trials of life that, as a Muslim, I believe life is a trial. And this is just another example of a test that's come in the direction of humans, and it's for humans now to see how best to address it.
Right. Well, I will come back. I will come back to you. I'm going to come to Elizabeth Oldfield. Before I do, just to say, if you would like to weigh in, as I said, the whole purpose of a thinking is to hear people's different points of view. And I realise that we've done something that back in my BBC days I would get terribly criticised for, which is to host a conversation about God with a group of people who all in some way or another have a relationship with faith and religion, rather than those people who may have a view that there's no business having faith or religion in our lives. So do just raise your hand. I'll see the blue hand come up and I'll come to you. I would also just like to make a point, picking up on Zia's, is that there was a survey done in the US last week of likely voters in the US who were asked whether or not they believed that the coronavirus was either a wake-up call to God or a sign of God's coming judgment. And 44% of people thought it was either one of those things, a wake-up call to God or a sign of God's coming judgment. And I think probably capital J on that. Elizabeth Oldfield.
Hi. Yeah, so I think what's really noticeable for me is this is where Christianity in particular departs somewhat from many world religions, that there is the particularity of the incarnation, the particularity of Jesus, and particularly Easter, which we're about to celebrate, is the thing that Christians will be dwelling on this time. I think, yes, we should approach the question of us possibly knowing what God is doing with fear and trembling and just park that. Yes. But the kind of theological resources of Christianity would say that God suffers with, that actually for Christians, God really is interested in the minutiae of human life, that by kind of coming in the person of Jesus, did live like a fully embodied human life of suffering and struggle. And I'm reminded, today I was thinking about the fact that the way that you die, when you're crucified, is a suffocation, that the Roman soldier who went around trying to break their legs, and didn't need to because Jesus was already dead, does that so that the lungs are compressed. And it's really kind of haunted me today, this sense that so many people, billions of people around the world, are struggling to breathe. And we are thinking about Easter. And so for Christians, where we'd go is not, is God sending this as a judgment? Someone explicitly asked that of Jesus in the Gospels, this tower fell on this people, Jesus, is it punishment for their sin? And he's like, no, it is. It's more complicated than that. But that even as we can't answer that question, we would draw great heart from that impulse of God to suffer with, to empathize, and to be with us in crisis and suffering. And I think that's for me, that's a real distinctive of my faith.
Can you, Elizabeth, can you tell us, because you're the presenter of this brilliant podcast, the Sacred Podcast, and it's amazingly good, but can you tell us a little bit about how you approach something like that now? Because it does seem, to Zia's point, that there is this real split between people of faith, some of whom who, if you like, turning to God to find a way of thinking about how they behave at this time, reaching out to people who are lonely, people in need. But there's also this group of people, and a large group, who are saying, actually, this is a sign. And there's something that's much closer to the book of Revelation here. How do you try to, if you like, straddle both of those groups?
Yeah, I think it's important to admit that, you know, the majority of the world is religious. 85% of the world is religious and climbing, and for the big majority of them, they will locate themselves in this kind of story, in that way of a sense of God's sovereignty, and these kind of crises being part of our understanding of God, and that is your classic understanding of God's work in the world. Many different stripes of theology would want to make that more subtle and more complicated. I don't think it's necessarily a problem. I think, you know, I would read the Bible differently, but it depends how people react to that. If it puts them into a defensive, tribal, isolating, shut down position, then that is not, in Christian terms, going to grow the fruits of the Spirit in us, is not going to make us more loving of our neighbour. But if we see that it's God's work in the world, and that spurs us on to further live out a life of loving God and loving our neighbour and seeking justice and all the things that the New Testament would be calling us to, then I don't think we necessarily have to be scared of that as a way of locating ourselves in a narrative. Okay,
that's helpful, and obviously the reason I ask you is, for many people it's profoundly problematic, that idea, and actually shuts off the idea of faith. It makes it seem as though something that is real world is being treated in a way that's otherworldly. I'd like to come back to that with the Rabbi and with Lord Singh and with you two, Zia. Before I do, though, can I just come to Tina Bernstein, who I think is here with us, and who made this interesting point, she was describing herself as, there you are, Tina. So saying you were Jewish but not religious. I think that's a popular position, so certainly in my family.
So I'd like to just start by saying I am Jewish. I'm second generation Holocaust survivor, you know, so I was actually brought up in Germany, believe it or not. And I went to a religious boarding school called Carmel College. And I remember one of the first weeks I went to one of the religious teachers and I said, well, look, why can't I switch on the lights on a Sabbath? You know, why is that? And they said, look, my dear, if you start questioning, you'll never believe. And I very quickly realized I will never believe, and I never have since then. But I've always been fascinated. And I used to go a lot to these religious studies, and they used to try to explain everything away with the Bible and why things happened. But what I wanted to say, it's really interesting because I'm probably in a world with people that are more spiritual rather than religious. I actually didn't know that 85% of the world is religious. Is that actually a truism?
No, it's true. It's true. What Elizabeth said is true. The majority of people, the majority of countries of the world are religious.
Right. No, I didn't know it was that high. I mean, I knew it was high, but I had no idea. So forgive me for my lack of knowledge in that. So from a spiritual view, and I think I put that in the comments. So, you know, even as somebody who's more spiritual rather than religious, I do think there is, you know, if we call it intervention, I call it Mother Nature has spoken and said, go into your rooms, you naughty kids, and think long and hard about how you're behaving in this world. And funnily enough, since then, I can only speak for the UK, obviously, we've had blue sky, sunshine, and, yes, you know, it's been quite incredible. So I don't know, you know, I'm as I said, I'm not religious, but I do believe life is about lessons, and it depends what we make out of it. And I think, as history tells us, some people will, you know, be transformed in many ways, and other people will just continue.
So your point in is, so you're comfortable with the idea, if you like, of a secular revelation, that this is a moment of revelation, but it doesn't need to be seen within the terms of Scripture.
For the religious terms, yes, I definitely believe in that, because I just believe that things happen for a reason, and I cannot look at this and go, I mean, you know, we can go into the conspiracy theories, but I just believe that there is something happening. It could be a collective energy, you know, we can call it anything we want, basically. I definitely believe in that. Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, I will. I'm going to bring that into the conversation. But before I do, I want to go to my fellow editor at Tortoise, who's left this lovely message in the line of chat as you were speaking, team, who said, "Those of us who believe in the principles of the Enlightenment have views on this too." So I'm going to come, if I might, to Matt. Hello, fresh from the Enlightenment. Matt, what have you got?
Matt, I'm designated spokesman for the Enlightenment tonight. This is such a fascinating because dealt with famously by C.S. Lewis in The Problem of Pain, which is if God is omnipotent and all-loving, how do things like this happen? And this is variously dealt with, particularly in the Christian tradition, by what's known as theodicy. And it is a fantastic three-card trick by the religious, which is that the religious claim divine inspiration for the good stuff and then let God off, total impunity, for all the bad stuff, usually with reference to free will and human evil, human-generated evil. But there's another way of looking at it, I think, which is that if God exists and allows something like coronavirus to happen, where a 13-year-old boy dies on his own, effectively from the equivalent of waterboarding, and then is buried without any of his family present. If God exists, then that God is either unbelievably indifferent or abominably capricious or possibly indifferent. And whichever of the three it is, certainly not worth worshipping. So I'm afraid that's my take on.
Well, I'm going to put that back. I'm going to put that, Lord Singh, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but I'm going to put that back to Elizabeth Oldfield. Elizabeth?
Am I still muted? There we go, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I mean, I feel the power of that. I think, you know, I've been a Christian, I've been an atheist, I've been a Christian again, and that question is the question. The question of suffering is I think, only really powerful and inescapable objection, and it's been a really serious objection for me at different points in my life. It is the cross that reconciles it for me. It is a God who is so clearly not indifferent to our suffering, and a God who I have experienced to be powerfully with me in suffering. That means that I can live in that tension and live in the kind of the goodness and the meaning and the hope and the community with which my faith enriches me. But it is an incredibly powerful human grief that I don't really want to try and explain away.
Elizabeth, thank you. Lord Singh?
When this whole coronavirus started a couple of months back, the concerns, I lightheartedly said it's all in Revelations. First of all, there were the storms and the floods. If we go back, remember a couple of months ago, the storms and floods all over the country. And then there is the pestilence. Now, that is light-hearted, but in reality, what I want to say is God does not get involved in the nitty-gritty of daily life. He has given us an opportunity to make this world a wonderful place or to totally ruin it. And if I give the example of a inner city development, when some houses are demolished for a new development, you see the surrounding area in a new light. Now, when something like that happens, when this coronavirus pandemic has inflicted suffering in the world, we now have an opportunity to look again. It's an opportunity to look if we're going, what sort of direction have we been going to? In my own mind and in speaking in the Lord's, I think ever since the United Nations been found. We've been going in the wrong direction, trying to play 18th and 19th century games of power politics, neglecting the common concerns of everyone. That it has just been power politics. Now we have the common concern. We are concerned about our neighbor. We are concerned about the well-being of other religions. And it brings us down back to earth with a shuddering jolt. And we should take the opportunity to look at our relationships with people of different faiths, see what we have in common, where we can agree, and the things which we disagree on but respect. It is a huge opportunity to make the world a better place.
Oh. Thanks, Lord Singh. I'm going to come to Hester McCreary, but Dan Green, I think you've seen, you made an interesting point, so I'd love to come to you in a moment too. Hester. Can we hear you? One moment. Speak away. Oh, no, I'm so can't hear you quite. Hang on. Can we hear you? Hester, while you're getting sorted out there, I'm going to go to Zia, if I may. Zia, I guess I just wanted to put to you the same point that Matt put, right? Which is that it's very hard to reconcile what we're seeing with the idea of a powerful, let alone loving God.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that point of view, but from my perspective, no matter how kind, generous, omnipotent, all-loving God is, I'm going to die one day, and I accept that. And nothing's going to change that. It's going to happen to everybody. And so this idea of bad as being something that is abnormal and therefore needs to have blame apportioned to it. And if we can't find any other cause, we'll blame God, because after all, he's the omnipotent one. I struggle with. What I see is both sides, the good and the bad. So all the good, because as a Muslim, I believe everything comes from God, good and bad, but everything's providing us with opportunities. And so if I decide tomorrow to give up my religion, I don't harm God in any way. And if I decide to be ultra religious and pray 500 times a day, I don't benefit God in any way, which makes me draw the conclusion that religion is not for God's benefit, it's for my benefit. And so then I have to follow that line of argument and say, well, if it's for human benefit, how do humans benefit from it? And I think incidents like, coronavirus or any other opportunity, and I said at the outset that, we have huge disasters which then make people question, whether it's the Holocaust or world wars or the plague or floods, whatever. Those things make us question the meaning of life, but it shouldn't take that. Day in, day out, we should be questioning the meaning of life, questioning those values that we live according to. And as Lord Singh just said, okay, take this as an opportunity to have those, to look at those common values and how we can improve life for human beings, because ultimately that's what it comes back to. We're here on earth, nowhere else.
So let me pick up a little bit on that, because I'm really struck by the speed at which everyone moves to this question of what we choose to make of it, how we act as a result of it. My colleague, actually, Tanya, just said something I thought really interesting about this, which is people have become united human beings. We've shown more love to each other than before. Tanya, I'm going to come to you in a second if I can. But Rabbi, as I said right at the beginning, we're holding this ThinkIn a couple of days before, many of us are going to, mark and celebrate Passover. The Daniel Steinberg has made you know, the point that the echoes are extremely difficult to deal with. They may be coincidental, they may be more meaningful than that. But of course, the story of the Exodus is marked by plagues. It's marked by that kind of disruption to life. What do you draw any meaning from the Passover story for the times we find ourselves in?
Yes. So the first meaning in the Passover story is that Judaism is about questioning. So when Tina was brought up at Carmel College with no questioning, that's certainly not Judaism, because the Passover, the Seder, which is when we get together and go through the story, is all about questioning and asking. And it's about the meaning of faith. So rather than about the question being who is God, the question is what is our faith? And you have very interesting examples going on of what is faith. You have the Passover example, where you're looking at the plagues as possible threats. You have people might say, I have faith, total faith, and therefore I'm going to go to mass funerals. And we've seen in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities data that shows that it doesn't matter how much faith you have all the faith in the whole wide world, but if you go to a mass funeral or a mass wedding, you're going to get sick. So one of the things that I think the Passover story says is, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. This is happening to all of us. If we choose to go to a funeral along with 300 other people, we all, not just those 300 people, are going to get sick, because we are linked with each other. We have a common fate. One of the beautiful things about the Passover is it says, first of all, we were slaves, which is a very important place to start. Not that we were kings and princes, but we were slaves. We know hardship, and we are all interlinked, because if one of us dies in the Red Sea when the waters close, we all will. If one of us gets a plague, we all will. And I think that the interlinked common narrative, where we ask questions and we say, we were slaves, you must think of yourself as part of this history. That's what's happening. This pandemic, we are the same as happening in China, in Iran, here, Italy. National borders have disappeared. Our fate is intertwined.
That's very interesting. I'm going to go back, if I can, also just Elizabeth Oldfield on that, because I was really struck. Before we held this think-in, I listened to both a sermon from Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and then a friend of mine passed on a video from the Pope that was talking about how to prepare for Holy Week and for Easter. Do you find, and I know you mentioned the cross, I know you mentioned the experience of suffocation, but is there a message from Easter that you think actually is meaningful and helpful?
Yes. Which is partly why the idea of celebrating it all in our tiny little brick boxes is so painful. I love Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche is one of the most extraordinary writers and philosophers, and one of the atheists that I respect the most, because he put his finger on something at the heart of Christianity, which is that its very symbol is of suffering, that it's shot through with this with the sense of death, with helping us make meaning out of and sit in the tension of the fragility of life. And every year Christians celebrate Good Friday, and churches go dark and quiet. And then in Holy Saturday, which is a liturgical word for what most people call Easter Saturday, we wait in the tension, in the now and the not yet, and hope for Easter Sunday. And that Easter Saturday, that day in between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, feels to me so emblematic of the human condition, the tension between the tragedy of the world and the beauty of it. And I want to spend my whole adult life learning how to live there and love people there and flourish there. And doing that every year, writing it in our hearts, writing it on our neurochemistry, feels to me to be a very healthy thing to do.
Elizabeth, thank you. I'm going to ask the same, if it's all right, of you, Lord Singh. Forgive me, I don't know enough about Sikh traditions or learning, but if I was trying to take a Sikh lesson from this, and I was trying to be instructed by Sikh teachings, how would I make sense of it?
There is a saying in Sikhism, "Dukh daru sukh rog pyara." That is that we gain something. Suffering is an opportunity to develop ourselves in different ways. We react to that. If everything is going smoothly and nicely, we don't think. We just, but suffering makes us think. It makes us think about our own suffering and the suffering of many other people. And I think, again, that this is an opportunity for us to think, where are we in this world? What have we done? We've destroyed the environment. We've create wars after wars where we bomb this group and then that group. That is not the life we should be living in the 21st century. That is crude 18th, 19th century politics. We need, this is an opportunity, a wake-up call. Cooperation, this idea that we can go it alone or American can go it alone. We are totally intertwined and in our destiny. And the sooner we realize that, the better.
And Lord Singh, how will Sikhs mark New Year? What do you think will be the, if you like, the message of Sikh New Year in 2020? How do you think it will be interpreted?
The Sikhs, we go along with the New Year celebrations, but we have Vaisakhi, where there was which is in April, where there was this followed the attempt by the Mughal ruler in India to convert everyone forcibly, and the Guru stood up against it. He stood for the tolerance and respect for all religions. And that is what we remember in Vaisakhi, the equality of all human beings. It's stressed again and again. And by the way, the BBC got upset when I wanted to talk about that, but that's the world we live in.
That's another whole thinking, but and a really juicy one. But can I just ask you, then the message that is then considered is about tolerance, is about the equality of all people. That's what happens at Vaisakhi. That's what the people mark next week. All right, and then I'm going to come back to there are lots of people who've made lots of comments I want to touch upon. But Zia, if I may, I just wanted to actually ask you the same thing. You said something very kind of affecting earlier on about life is a trial, and this is another episode in that trial. Is that the way you as a Muslim would look at this?
Absolutely. But again, what I would say is that it shouldn't take the big trials for me to be mindful of this question. Every single day, there are small trials. You know, your children testing your patience, they are trials. Going to work and having to put up with various colleagues, they are trials. And so there are plenty of trials. It's just that we don't regard them in that way as having any sort of divine element to them. Whereas I would say that everything has lessons within it. And maybe this, from when we try and, when we look at what's going to come on the other side of this, this is a trial not just for individuals, but for whole communities. And so for my community, for Muslims, I would say, again, this is an opportunity to look at the way we do religion. Is it just the sum total of our religious rituals? As long as we've ticked the fasting box and the praying box, have we done religion?
Yeah.
Much more than that.
I think I'm going to come back in a moment to Matt, because I feel as though what I wanted to do was hear a Christian, a Jewish, a Sikh, a Muslim. So it sounds like one of those jokes, but a set of views about what religion can offer us and what guidance it can provide us. Matt, I'm going to make you the designated humanist / atheist. What, if you like, are the lessons that can be drawn from a moral, enlightened world that has nothing to do with God?
Well, I mean, of course, there's a lot of coincidence and overlap between, ethically speaking, between the religions of the world and the non-religious outlook. It's just that the religions of the world are part of the infancy of our species. And what you often hear discussed in these contexts are actually mythic practices which make us feel good, but don't actually presuppose or necessitate the existence of a deity. I mean, what I'm still not hearing in any of this is where God is, except as is he the setter of the stage, this trial, and if he is the setter of the stage, could he just dismiss the charges if he wanted? It seems to me that what this has showed, in fact, is what is commonsensical, which is that great human suffering like this brings out both, I mean, it's a cliche, but it brings out both the best and the worst in people. The phenomenal outpourings of decency, other forms of behavior which are not so appetizing. But the decency doesn't presuppose a divinity. It doesn't require a divinity at all.
Right. Okay, well, it's very good. I mean, I'm interested, do you think then when you see the Pope make a, statement to Roman Catholics around the world, one that doesn't try to explain God's agency, but looks to people to take instructional guidance from his teachings, or from God's teachings, from Jesus Christ's teachings, that you feel that's a cop-out?
No, I mean, I believe in freedom of religious worship. It's a fundamental Enlightenment principle. I'd stand in front of a church to protect someone's right to worship there, but I mean I can't share in the beliefs, the faith that underpins what the Pope is saying, even if there may be some sort of overlap in the principles, the social ideas that he's proposing.
All right, Matt, thanks very much. Dan Green, can I come to you? Because I think you made a comment in the chat that says the reason that we're here is that we've turned away from God.
Yeah, the Bible makes it abundantly clear that humans have gone away from God. If you look at the Ten Commandments, any three of the versions you'd like to choose from, you'll see that there's this thing, it's like, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and it's like, gives you conditions, 10 of them, which we have all failed. So lusting is a great one that God says. Jesus says, like, if you've looked at a woman lustfully or a man lustfully, you've committed adultery, you're an adulterer, and so under God's wrath. And the point is that the suffering is not God's pouring out his wrath upon us, not at all. It's that we've decided to choose our way to live and the way that is right. God gives and takes life regardless of disease. When you come to the end of your life, if God is the giver of life, he removes it and takes it from you. But he abundantly wants to make you sure that you want to live, if it is your choice. The Bible never forces anything on you. He says, if you come to me freely. That God loves every person here equally, but he doesn't want to force into a relationship. So if the Bible says that if you come to Jesus, you will be saved, and proclaim him as your Lord, you'd be saved. But it doesn't say that God will force you, which would be hell, forcing someone who doesn't want to spend time with you. And so this coronavirus suffering is nothing new on the Christian spectrum. We are all suffering, worthy of death. Turning away from God is what our punishment is for that, because it's wrong. We've rejected God as the ruler, and so we die. And therefore, yeah.
But Dan, can I just ask you a question though? That's I can see that if you have that great perspective, that point of view makes sense. But does it not make a difference to you what age and what circumstances you die in? Is there not a meaning to suffering in that sense?
I think there's two ways of answering this. Paul makes 2 points in his letters. He says, one, what can the potter say? What can the clay say to its potter? And that's because God has given it value. But the secondary point is, does it matter what age or stuff? It alienates a right of me to say that I am more important than God because an age or a time being at me dying, I could drop dead at any moment. It's one of the scariest things. But why should I get to decide if God knows everything about the universe when I should die? And I think he's right in giving and taking life in that circumstance. Okay, Dan, thank you. That is really interesting, and let's put it this way: a counterpoint to Matt's view. Certainly that. Dan, thank you. Can I Hester McCreary, who has, I think,
hopefully
recovered. Is she there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, got you. Hello.
Yay! Thanks, guys. Sorry, I'm using a work MacBook that has Zoom linked to that account, and my MacBook was getting repaired in an ice smash shop and has now gone. Nobody's contacted me about that since the lockdown, so who knows? But thanks. My point was coming back to like Matt's point on the Enlightenment, which really struck a chord with me, because I was lucky enough to study Enlightenment studies in dual with KCL and the British Museum. So the Enlightenment has a massive fundamental part on my very sort of conscious waking being. But equally, I've been doing yoga for about 5 years now, and I only ever went to it for fitness. But eventually it's led me on a spiritual journey that really throws up some questions about the Enlightenment principles that were really a massive part of my thinking. So it's interesting in this sort of the COVID-19 crisis where I can see, and it kind of shakes my belief a bit in Enlightenment principles, because so much of what I understood to pin down the world in sort of reason and rationality through a slightly more spiritual journey. The Enlightenment to me seems to have left some possible gaps in the way we're living, basing it so very much on the physical material world. That I don't know. It's an interesting sort of moment for me.
So explain why is that challenging your thinking about Enlightenment principles?
Well, because I was very much with the Enlightenment through the principles of reason and rationality.
Yes.
I was raised as a really strict atheist. Like my if I asked what happens when you die, you know, my parents were like just Richard Dawkins' biggest fans. They were like, yeah, right. Nothing. It's just like lights switched off. So any principle other to that to me was I really couldn't comprehend. But through doing yoga and a more spiritual thing. So sorry, with the atheist principle in mind, I don't know, the Enlightenment, and it's not to say what Matt said, there's not a place for faith and religion, but the principles of reason and rationality made a huge amount of sense to me in that waking up thinking. But then from a spiritual sense, and given the current crisis, it makes me question whether or not the Enlightenment did leave a few gaps in the way we live.
That's really interesting. I want to pick up. There's someone here I think is called Ahukuchis Fahani, who's made this great point that the problem is that some of us want to find answers to everything. I'd love to explore that with you if you want to weigh in. But I'm just going to come back to the Rabbi, Laura Janner-Klausner. Rabbi, are you there? What do you
I'm here.
Make of this? So
there's one of the things that's happening in a couple of weeks is Holocaust Memorial Day, the Israeli one. And there's an amazing story that Elie Wiesel, who was a Holocaust survivor, then a Nobel Prize winner, tells, that they were at Auschwitz, true story, and they were sitting around in the bunk at night in the block 17, and they decided to put God on trial. Let's put God on trial. How could there be a God if this is happening? And they debated and they debated and they questioned and they questioned. And at the end of the debate, they voted. They voted there was no God because of what was happening at Auschwitz. And then they all stood up and they said the evening prayer and they said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one." They still prayed despite what was happening.
And despite having concluded that there was no God.
That's right. And I like that view of faith. I don't see faith as the answers to everything. I think that's why it's faith and not data.
Yes, I'm going to go to Tanya. Are you there? I'm going to just ask my colleague. Hello, Tanya. How are you, by the way?
I'm good. I'm all right.
Are you okay? Good. I'm glad to hear it. So this is the point that you were making in response to Matt, that this is faith, that there is something that can't be simply rationally explained. Is that that's your view?
I mean, definitely in these debates, and it's really hard for people who are religious, because there's almost a pressure to try and talk and rationalize it to make people believe. But the thing about believing is that you actually have to have faith in it to understand. And so when we're talking about this COVID-19, it's like it's a terrible situation. But if you actually believe in God, you know that that's not something that is of him. So but what has come out of this is people have been stripped away of the things that they placed value on, whether it was work or whether it was going out with friends, whether it was I don't know, just if your source was from a job, for example, and you've been made redundant, you have to sit there with yourself and kind of reflect on what matters to you the most in life. And I think that can only do good for humanity, because I was saying this to one of my friends, that regardless of the horrible stuff that have happened with this, it's actually been a blessing in disguise, because I know for a fact it's made me really slow down and think about, actually, even as a Christian, what really matters to me. Does my relationship with God change because I'm not going to church on Sundays? And so, yeah, that's why I see it can.
And does it, by the way, is it making a relationship change with God because you don't go to church?
Yeah, it's because, so I think that church is so separate from an actual relationship with God. And so actually, when I've got an opportunity to, like right now, it's allowed me to maybe be deeper and more faithful with my relationship with God, rather than actually going to church. And can I just add as well, how if we look at our government, for example, the homeless people, rough sleeping has been a big problem, but somehow they've made a solution and made a way for people to be sheltered. And I think that the government especially, and the way that our society is shaped, has forced us to really go against that and help people and accommodate others. So how can we not see God in that?
Okay, I'm gonna, in the last we've got just under 10 minutes. In the last, Tim's, I want to just come back, if I can, to Elizabeth Oldfield and Lord Singh to start with. I was lucky on Friday, I recorded an interview with Robert Putnam. Professor Putnam is a Harvard professor. He wrote a really amazing book called Bowling Alone, which is all about social capital. It's all about the idea of how we actually create a sense of community rather than a sense of individualism. And he tracks, if you like, the history of the I society versus the we society. And so the reason we did the interview was to try to understand whether or not the pandemic is likely to lead to a reinforcement of individualism, let's take care of me and my people, or is it going to actually create really a sense of community? Will we look beyond people in our own walks of life to those people that we don't know? And I just wondered, Elizabeth, if I can start with you, whether or not you think that this is a moment in more than just rhetoric, because obviously the rhetoric is easy, in more than rhetoric, that you will see some kind of connection between, people of faith and people of none, or whether or not you expect that actually something as traumatic as what we're seeing is going to reinforce those divisions between, people who believe in God and people who don't.
Yeah, I think I just need to be honest and say we don't know yet. I wrote down earlier, I was trying to work out why this time is so discombobulating. And I wrote down, it's a crisis that is at once isolating and localizing and globalizing. And that means that we are sitting on a lot of axes here. And the experiences of individuals are very different. The experience of people in different nations are very different. I recently interviewed Rabbi Sachs, and his book similarly picks up a lot of those Putnam themes, both in Bowling Alone and in American Grace, and traces this move from the I to the we to the I society. And we spoke about what this moment might mean. And I am cautiously hopeful that our interconnectedness is more visible than it's ever been and undeniable. And that sense of my actions contribute to the common good or otherwise, that my life is in another's hands and their life is in my hands, is so humbling and so grounding that if we can internalize it, if we can sit with it for long enough, it has a chance of changing us in the same way that the post-war consensus, the Trump glorias, were possible because of that moment in the Second World War where our commonality was extremely visible. If we just distract ourselves, if we just reboot the economy in exactly the same way as it's been before, if we ignore the looming worst threat of the climate emergency, then we will squander this moment. But it's certainly the closest that we've got in a while to looking ourselves in the face, I think.
And Lord Singh, thank you, Elizabeth. And Lord Singh, can I come back and end with you, if I may? do you, I know that you hope that this is going to be a moment that spurs a different kind of internationalism, a different sense of collaboration, but do you actually think it will?
I can only say I hope it will. The immediate reaction to this virus is looking after ourselves and our own, but we recognize that there are wider implications of why it happened, widespread in this way, and we should be looking outwards. I see Sikh religion as a path. The founders of our different religions taught us paths through life where we get the most out of a short span of life. And if we follow the path, we'll be happy. But if things go wrong, and if we decide to go this way or that way, and something goes wrong, the last thing it's ridiculous to blame God if we don't follow the instructions. So I think we have commonalities between our different religions. We should begin to think about following those rather than the 19th century politics of hate of one group against another group.
All right, well, Lord Singh, on that note, and a call to tolerance and understanding, I will try and do what we do at the end of a think-in, which is to try and bring this together. And to be totally blunt, this is not what journalists are made for. Let's be honest. We had a think-in at the very, very beginning of this crisis with Julia Samuel, a therapist. And as a psychotherapist, it was really striking that she said, look, you're trying to rationalize emotions, and you can't simply do that. And in this conversation, of course, you can't square the circle of those people of faith and those people of none. There are, I think, some things that you can take away that are meaningful. One is, I think, the point right at the top, which was then echoed by Tina, which is, it is possible to recognize that a moment of apocalypse need not be seen simply in the scriptural sense, but in the original sense that it is a revelation, it's an unveiling. And, you know, both Tina and the Rabbi made exactly that point. And it does, I think, as Inderjit Singh made clear, give us an opportunity to reflect on the way in which we're living our lives and how we could and should do it differently. You don't have to make a decision on faith to see that as a real spur to action. I think there's something that's undeniable, which is that it's really striking that the people of faith are talking about this as a moment to reset and consider our behavior and find God in our behavior. But I do take very keenly Matt's point, which is that does let God off the hook on the responsibility for what's happening on earth. And that is going to be a big division, an insuperable one, between people of faith and people of none. That said, I think that the three really striking things, listening to people of religion who spend their time thinking about religion, were three. One was, I was really affected by what Elizabeth said about a life considering suffering, considering death, considering the fragility of life itself. And whichever means you have of doing that, having a means of doing it seems to me to an incredibly valuable thing at this time. Secondly, I think there is a real question about what are the ways in which we create connections. And I was struck by Tanya's point, not just the connections in the community of church, but with the idea of God. And that was obviously very powerful. But the final thing is, I go back to the point right at the top, which is there is an opportunity here to make common cause. And the common cause that we can make is going to be about the things that we can change rather than the things that we can debate. And I hope that whether you're religious or not, this conversation over the course of the last hour has given a chance to reflect on what we could or might make common cause when all this is done. So personally, I found it an incredibly interesting and thought-provoking conversation. If you saw me stumble a couple of times about how to ask it, the ideas were just too big for someone who's used to dealing with your day-to-day news flow. But I hope that you found it interesting too. If you're a member of Tortoise, welcome home. If you're new, please do join up. We're running a 30-day free trial because we want as many people in on these conversations as possible. So do that. You can go to our website or you can just download the Tortoise app. The one thing that's difficult about a think-in is that there is a lovely, lovely period when it's over, when we've applauded each other and then we hang around and chat. We're going to try and do that in a rather clumsy way, which is we're going to wave at each other to signal that we can all go and do something else. Thank you very much for coming. And if you want to hang around and message each other or chat, please do. But a big thank you to you, Lord Singh, a big thank you to Elizabeth Oldfield, to you, Rabbi Laura Janner-Klausner, and Zia, I can't see, but I'm sure is there somewhere. Yes, there you are, Zia Chaudhry as well. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks everyone, good night, take care.